Okay, so I'm back. It's been 2 months. And I've worked my way through Daniel 1 to 5. I'm going to review those 5 chapters today and also do Daniel 6. So Daniel 1 to 6 are the historical part of Daniel, chronologically. You get Daniel going into Babylon, and then at the end you have him, the end of his life. So then from 7 to 12, they're different. In fact, chapter 7 is arguably the most difficult chapter in the whole of the Old Testament, if not the Bible. So I'll get to that in about 3 weeks. I ask if it was possible for you to read through Daniel 1 to 6 at home through the week. I don't know if you're able to do that, but it doesn't matter because I'm going to go through it now. So in chapter 1, which is an introductory chapter in Daniel, Daniel is from a royal family in Judah, or from a noble family anyway. And Nebuchadnezzar is building his empire. And he comes to Judah or Israel, Palestine, and there the king won't cooperate. He doesn't know whether he wants to side with Nebuchadnezzar or with the Egyptians. And so Nebuchadnezzar, in order to try to keep him into line, Jehoiakim, he takes 10,000 hostages and he drags them off to Babylon. And one of those is Daniel and his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, that we come across in chapter 3 especially. And they're only 14, 15 years of age. So they're taken as captives and they're taken off to Babylon, and they end up in the palace. And there they're young men just sorting out where they want their life to go. You can see that they're faithful to God right from the beginning. And they decide that they're going to... I hadn't even started the stopwatch, don't I? They decided that they're not going to, if possible, be absorbed into the Babylonian culture. So they're given the best of food. They get the right to sit at not at the king's table, but to participate in all of the good things that Babylon had to offer. But they actually ask if they could just have vegetables and water. It was just a symbol that they didn't want to be absorbed into the Babylonian culture and compromise their relationship with God. And that's how chapter 1 plays out. And you see that they do well on veggies and water. Their lives could have ended there. I mean, they could have been told, no, you can't talk like that. That's it, you're out. But it didn't. God was with them. And you see that God is with Daniel, particularly, and with these young men, because he has a part for them to play in what unfolds in the next 60 years throughout the Babylonian Empire and then beyond as well. So that's chapter 1. And then in chapter 2, now chapter 2 is a pair to chapter 7. And I will come back to chapter 2 a little when I do chapter 7, which is a really difficult chapter. But they, very soon after the events of chapter 1, and Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And in this dream, he dreams of a statue with a head of gold, an upper body of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and a feet of iron and clay mixed together. So it's a statue made of various different substances. And then a rock that is cut out without hands strikes the statue, basically turns it to dust, which the wind blows away, and then the rock itself becomes a huge mountain that fills the whole earth. So Nebuchadnezzar has that dream, but he can't remember it, or he can't remember all of it. And he gets his wise men in, and they've got no idea. They say to him, well, look, you tell us what the dream is and we'll tell you the meaning. Well, Nebuchadnezzar says, well, I can't remember it. I want you to tell me what it was and what it means. And they can't do that. But however, God enables Daniel to do that. And he's only a boy of about 16 or 17 years of age. You see this as you see the story unfold. And so Daniel says, look, each part of the kingdom, of the statue, O great king, see that throughout it, represents a different kingdom. You are the head of gold, and then other kingdoms will follow, but ultimately all empires will be replaced by something greater that's not of human origin, and this will fill the earth. That's what the meaning of your dream is. Now, it's really just a compacted or summary of the future and how things will end up in the end. And so, I mean, Nebuchadnezzar's relieved because he realises, well, I'm okay. That's really, if you see the outcome of the dream, I'm the head of gold, great. He doesn't take much interest in what's going to happen in the future. But Daniel is raised to a position of authority. He's even put in charge of the wise men. which would have been interesting because he thought very differently to they do. But that's the picture that you see there in chapter 2. Now, chapter 4 and 5 are a pair where Nebuchadnezzar, the first king of Babylon, or what they call the Neo-Babylonian Empire, Nebuchadnezzar and what followed him, and Belshazzar, who was the last king of a disintegrating empire. Those two chapters 4 and 5 are compared. In chapter 4, Daniel's about 30 years of age. So he's been in a position that Nebuchadnezzar placed him in of authority for about 15 years. And Nebuchadnezzar has another dream. It's a dream of a massive tree that fills a large part of the earth. And it's chopped down, and it turns out that the tree is him. It's actually Nebuchadnezzar. It's Daniel interprets it to him and says, "Sadly, King, this is you. You're proud and arrogant, and God's going to humble you." And then it tells us that about a year later, Nebuchadnezzar goes mad, and he wanders around in the fields like a wild animal for about 7 years. And then it's in chapter 4, after 7 years, he repents and he glorifies God, and he's restored to his kingdom. In fact, it becomes even greater than it was before. And then he dies soon after that. And he dies, as we see in chapter 4 and 5, as a believer in Daniel's God. Now, it's just interesting because Nebuchadnezzar was a very evil man. He did terrible things. And yet, Daniel prayed for him. Daniel was patient with him and never gave up on Nebuchadnezzar. Neither did God. And as you see things unfold, that really, I'd have to say, nasty man, as you look at what we know about him, he turned to God, became a believer in Daniel's God, and he'll be, as far as we know from this story, he'll be in heaven. Interesting. I mean, I'll get to heaven, I'll go and say, "Nebuchadnezzar, you're here. How did that happen?" But, he repented and he turned to Daniel's God, and he is forgiven by God and becomes a believer in Daniel's God. It's a message that comes through Daniel, but one of the things in that chapter is don't give up on people. Daniel never gave up on Nebuchadnezzar, and in the end, Nebuchadnezzar became a believer. So chapter 4 is paired to chapter 5, which is about Belshazzar, the last king of Babylon. So the empire, after Nebuchadnezzar dies, the empire is weakened, and they have several kings, but there's palace intrigue and murders and general mayhem throughout the empire. And then the king, who's a young boy, king comes to power, is quite a young boy, and he is killed in a coup, and Nabonidus becomes king. It was interesting to go to the British Museum and just see a little bit of the story unfolding. I was just there like 6 weeks ago, and to see these names, and there they are, these little clay tablets and things that go back thousands of years, and just to see what the story of Daniel actually there in the museum, and some of the things that it says there, really interesting, where the Bible and archaeology fit together very closely. Anyway, the young boy king is killed, Nabonidus comes as king, but he's not really interested in being king. And so he takes off to Arabia, and he leaves the kingdom as a regent of his son Belshazzar. So Belshazzar rules in Babylon for 17 years. And during this time, we see, almost as if the Babylonians were unaware of it, there's the rise of the Medes and the Persians as a major power. And ultimately, they attack the Babylonians, they defeat their army, and they become, they surround Babylon. So Babylon's a very impressive city. Its walls are almost 100 metres high, and they're 26 metres wide. Just an enormous city. It takes up about 22 kilometres, the city. And so what's the response of Belshazzar when his army's defeated, and he's, he goes and locks himself in the city, and there he basically has a party. And during this orgy, we might say, he gets the temple, the precious items from the temple in Jerusalem had been brought to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar and placed in a storehouse. The cups and the plates and They're special in the use of worship of God in Jerusalem. Well, Belshazzar decides that he'll get these out and he'll drink from the cups and mock Israel's God. And so he does that. And in a sense, God takes up the challenge. And you see a hand appears. This was a message I gave on the week that I left. A hand appears out of nowhere and writes on the plaster on the wall. When Belshazzar sees this hand and he sees it right on the wall, well, he's woken from his drunken stupor and he calls in his wise men, but none of them have got any idea what's happening or what it means. And so Daniel is called for. So Daniel, since Nebuchadnezzar's death, which is about 20 years before this, he'd been put out to pasture. He's now about in his mid-70s, so he's summoned. It's Belshazzar's mother that says, there's someone that can tell you what this means. It's Daniel. So Daniel is brought in, and there's a writing on the wall, and he says to Belshazzar, he says, look, the writing, he just says it in the language, mene, tekel, parsin. He says, basically, Belshazzar, you're fallen short. You're not come up to scratch. He said, and he really doesn't hold back, as we saw when we did this chapter a few months ago. You knew what happened to your grandfather. You knew what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. And yet you choose to mock God in this way. He said, tonight, your kingdom is taken away from you and it's given to the Medes of the Persians. And that night, Babylon fell. Even while Daniel was speaking to Belshazzar, the Persians were in the city. Herodotus, a historian writing a bit over 100 years later, said they actually dammed the Euphrates River that flowed underneath Babylon. And as the river dropped below the walls, then the soldiers got in under the walls on the riverbed where the water was about waist deep. However, the Cyrus cylinder, and I saw that it's wonderful to see these things in the British Museum. You sort of see this and you see the interpretation down below. And Cyrus and Darius were the same people. Just one's a Median name and one's a Persian name in this instance. You see the Cyrus cylinder, it says that basically the people in Babylon were so disillusioned with their leaders, meaning Belshazzar, that they just opened the door and let Cyrus or Darius in, basically giving up the city. So the Persians entered the city. Unusual for those days, very few people were killed. Often there was a general massacre, but very few people were killed. Belshazzar was killed, a couple of the higher officials, but everybody else seemingly just kept their positions. Things just rolled on. So that is chapter 4 and 5. So now I just want chapter 3 and 6 on each side of them are also a pair. So you have a sort of a pair. One is an introductory chapter. The pairing of 2 and 7. 7 I'll come to in a couple of weeks. Pairing of 4 and 5. So Nebuchadnezzar is compared to Belshazzar. And then you've got a pairing also of 3 and 6. So chapter 3 is about the fiery furnace. And this happened in about the same year as Nebuchadnezzar had just got so frustrated with the king of Judah that he decided to wipe the city out. So he turns up with his army, completely destroys Jerusalem, decimates Judah, burns down the temple and drags everybody off into exile. So it's 586 BC. It's a significant date in the history of Israel. And Daniel and his friends had been in Babylon at this stage they would have been around 33 years old. So they've been there for about 15 years. And Nebuchadnezzar erects a statue. And he says, all right, when the music plays, everyone's commanded to bow, all his officials are commanded to bow down in front of this statue. Now, Daniel's not mentioned in this chapter, so he just must have been away at this time. But Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, Daniel's friends and other Israelite captives, they refuse to bow down to the statue. And so they're thrown into the fiery furnace. We've done this chapter. If you want to see these, look over my sermons, which are on the website. You can see each of these with more details that are unfolded there. So they're unharmed by the furnace, not even a smell of burning. And Nebuchadnezzar, when he looks into the furnace, he sees another figure. He sees something that, well, to him it looks like another one of his gods. In the furnace with Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. And that's when he says, look, come out. All right, I'm going to let you off with a warning. And so they come out, but he sees another figure in there when they're actually in the furnace. Now, we might think that that's Jesus, and it might be Jesus. But it might have also been an angel. But Nebuchadnezzar thinks it's just another one of his gods, and you don't really get any details on that. So today the chapter is chapter 6, which is paired with that chapter, and it's about Daniel in the lion's den. So both those chapters, chapter 3 and chapter 6, are about God's amazing deliverance. In one instance from a fiery furnace, in another instance from the lion's den. In this chapter that was read by Ross, the king in question now is Darius the Mede. So there's been a change in empire. The Babylonian Empire has fallen, and it's been replaced by the Medes and the Persians. So I just want to compare a little bit between those two stories, the fiery furnace story and the throne of the lion's den story. So in chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, they've already been in positions of responsibility in the kingdom. And so it's surprising that Nebuchadnezzar so quickly just threw them into the furnace, because they've been serving him faithfully for about 15 years. In chapter 6, Daniel had been marginalised after the death of Nebuchadnezzar. But now there's a change in empire. As I said, Darius is in charge. And he recognises that Daniel is special. He would have heard what happened on the last night of the Babylonian Empire when Daniel interpreted the writings on the wall. He knows about Daniel's reputation, and he can see that Daniel would be useful as an advisor. That's obvious. Got experience, he's got integrity, he's got wisdom, and Darius really recognises these things. So he wants him brought out of retirement and actually not just put back into a position of responsibility, but put as the top job in the land. Now he's a Jewish exile, and the other officials, they don't want this. They don't like Daniel. They probably don't like that he's got integrity. And they don't like the friendship that's developing between Darius and Daniel. So they're out to get rid of him. This is pretty soon after the conquest of the Babylonian by the Persians. And the Persians had quite a different attitude towards the Jews. Nebuchadnezzar had had the Jews dragged off to Babylon and various parts of the empire with fish hooks through their lips so they wouldn't slow down. I mean, he was a nasty man, as were the Babylonians, and spread them throughout the empire. But when Darius came to power, he allowed the Jews to go back to Israel. The 70 years of exile was up, and he said, you can return home. Now, if Daniel had been raised to this position, which Darius was considering doing, then he would be able to oversee that process. He would be able to protect the Jews returning to Israel. He would be able to facilitate it and just make it work well, because he'd have the top job in the land. And so his enemies don't want this. You know, they're not given a lot of details, but they're out to get him. And they come up with a plan, as we saw when it was read. So in both chapter 3 with Nebuchadnezzar and here in chapter 6, you see that they're pretty self-centered, these kings. Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 3 is arrogant. I mean, he's narcissistic. He has mood swings. We know that about Nebuchadnezzar. And just because the guys refuse to bow down to his idol, he has them thrown into the fiery furnace, even though they'd faithfully served him for years. Now, Daniel, you also see Darius' self-centeredness. And Daniel's enemies are able to use that in order to get what they want, or they wanted, hopefully wanted, in getting rid of, being able to get rid of Daniel. So if we just concentrate now on chapter 6, which was what was read, and we'll just work our way a little bit through that. So it's a pretty straightforward chapter. Daniel's enemies can't find anything to actually pin on him. He just doesn't seem to have any weaknesses. He's just got an exemplary character. There's no skeletons in the closet. He lives an uncompromising life, just centered around integrity. And you see from a godly perspective that his life's centered around prayer and acceptance of God's will for his life. Look, he's someone you want to emulate. If you think, well, what would I like my life to be? Well, have a look at Daniel and say, well, I think I'll follow the example of Daniel. Someone of which nothing negative is said in the whole book of Daniel about him. So his enemies can't find anything wrong, but they know that he prays 3 times a day. And he prays openly, with his shutters open, facing Jerusalem. And so I think they know what they're going to, how this is the only weakness they can actually find. Can he maybe use this against him? So they hatch a plan. They come to the king, and this was, as was read, they say to the king, "Is it not true, a great one," massaging his pride a little bit, "that if a ruling is made and put into writing, that nobody," they don't say even you, but that's sort of implied, "can change it." So you can see that they massaged the king's narcissism by saying that for 30 days people had prayed to nobody but you, O king. Isn't that one? Aren't you wonderful? So this you get the suggestion here that maybe it was thought that the king was a god. Now that might be possible, but you don't necessarily need to read that into it. But you can see how it plays out. Make a law, 30 days. Everyone must pray to you, otherwise they get thrown in the lion's den. So Darius agrees. I mean, foolishly he agreed. You'd think he would have thought about the motives a little bit. He would have known these people. Nevertheless, he agrees. The rule is signed and sealed. And of course, they know exactly where to find Daniel. They know exactly what's going on. He's there. As soon as he hears the rule, the law's been passed, he goes straight into his room, opens up the shutters, and without hesitation begins to pray 3 times a day as he had before. I think in Daniel's case, even if the law had been said that it was only going to be for 1 day, there was no way Daniel was not going to do it. He knew that there was a challenge on between these guys and him. And if it wasn't this, they'd find something else. So this was it. Bring it out in the open. Let's do it. If God's going to protect me, he'll protect me. If God wants me to die, if it's the end of my life, then that's fine. Daniel was, let's say he's about 75. He'd been faithful to God all his life. He probably thought, well, they've got me now. Daniel probably expected that he would die. Or if he was going to be saved by God, well, that was actually really in God's hands. But he wasn't going to compromise. I think there's a real example as you go through these 6 chapters. And you think about the young guys and Daniel. They just didn't compromise. It didn't matter what the consequences were. They were going to be faithful to God no matter what might be the outcome. So they come to the king. They say to the king, you passed the law. Everyone's to pray to you. We've found someone that is one of the exiles, Daniel. Now the king realises straight away that they've tricked him. So this is funny. This is the best plan they could come up with. Because even if they'd got Daniel thrown in the lions, then he'd been eaten by the lions. The king would certainly have been out to get these guys. They tricked him. They knew that, he knew that. So I don't know what they were expecting the outcome to be. But as we read, that's not what happened. So what happens is they tell the king, he realises he's been tricked. So he tries to get around the law all the way up till sunset. He can't think of anything. So Daniel is thrown in the lion's den, seals put on. You don't hear the lions eating him, so I suppose you wonder what's happening. I don't know. You saw the story as it was read. The king goes home. I think it's very funny. It says he can't sleep. That's all right. It says he doesn't eat anything. That's all right. But he said that he forewent entertainment for the night. That must have been really tough, to forgo entertainment for one night. I mean, some of these verses are strange. I think, goodness, when he's worried about Daniel in the den, I don't think entertainment would have been the main thing on his mind. Nevertheless, the next morning, first thing, off he goes back to the den. Daniel, are you okay? Daniel's, fine, I'm just stroking these little pussycats here. Now, you don't know what's going on inside the den, but he says, I'm fine, God's protected me. And he comes out, he shows no harm. The lions haven't touched him at all. And so it's just interesting that you see then that they brought out the enemies that had challenged him. Them and their families are all thrown into the lion's den. That was just the way they did it in those days, a sort of corporate responsibility. Wives and children get thrown in as well. That's just the way it goes. So in the end of the poem, you see Darius or Cyrus, whatever, actually praising God. And you could say, well, he's actually turned to faith and belief in Daniel's God. So the little poem or hymn that was read out at the end of the chapter. In the living God, or Darius says, praise to the living God, he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His kingdom will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. And so, it'd be really interesting to get to heaven and to see Nebuchadnezzar turn up and Darius turn up together. The two kings of that era. Is that possible? Well, yeah, it's possible. But that Darius also became a believer in Daniel's God, as it had been with Nebuchadnezzar. With Nebuchadnezzar, you see the slow process of softening and how he changed. He had to go mad for 7 years to actually get there. Whereas with Darius, there seems to be an interest in Daniel's God straight away after this deliverance. He's getting the point. I shouldn't have really focused on me. And he begins to think about the reality of Daniel's God. So chapters 3 and 6, as pairs, are extreme examples of deliverance, aren't they? You look through the Old Testament, you don't see a lot of these sorts of miracles in the Old Testament. Jesus did these sorts of miracles, but you don't see many of them in the Old Testament. And what can we expect? You see, when Hebrews 11, that was also read, part of it, reflects on this, it just looks at Old Testament examples, and it gives the examples of someone being saved from the lions. So that's referring to this incident in the Old Testament. So you see people saved in absolutely unusual situations where God intervened and changed things and protected people. But you also see in Hebrews 11 that sometimes he didn't do that. Sometimes people were allowed to suffer within the purposes of God. It's not always easy to sort out, well, what's the purposes of God? What the difference it differs in every particular situation. Jeremiah was a prophet in exactly the same time as Daniel, and he went through enormous suffering. They did terrible things to him. They didn't actually kill him, but they pretty well did everything short of killing him, and they persecuted him terribly. So you get Daniel on the one hand really protected from any kind of persecution at all in a physical way, but Jeremiah is quite different in the way that it worked out for him. Now Daniel probably died soon after this. We don't really hear of him again, but we've been through, this is chapters 1 to 6 that I've been through, and it's a wonderful example of a particular person in a relationship with God in a really tough situation in the exile. And I just encourage you, if you didn't read it this week, go and have a look at that. The messages are on the internet. Just go and think about the relationship that Daniel had with God and your relationship with God. But there are miracles. There are a number of miracles in Daniel. The miracle of protection in the fiery furnace and the lion's den are some of the two most amazing stories in the Old Testament. But there's also that God gave Daniel the ability to interpret dreams. And that's another sort of miracle. When the wise men couldn't do it, God told Daniel what the dream was and what the actual meaning was. So there's a number of interventions of God in these 6 chapters. Even the fact that they were allowed to eat vegetables and water and drink water, that in itself was amazing, because that would not be the expected outcome of making that request. So God is there working things out in a way that wouldn't be the normal expected outcome. So I just wondered, what do you think about miracles? Just want to change direction, a few more minutes, the end of the message. Have you had miracles in your life? Because I spoke to people who don't even believe in God and they have miracles in their life. But sometimes people who are Christian, they just trust God because they have a relationship with God, that God will do things in their lives. You ever pray for a car parking spot when you go shopping? Somehow expect that God will give you a car parking spot. Well, what happens when you don't get one? I mean, has God let you down? I would just like to get into the mindset of people that actually pray for car parking spots, because I know people do it, and they say, "I got one." Well, that's great. God's changed the whole universe so that you get a car parking spot. That's it's interesting. Maybe at morning tea we can talk a little bit about miracles, what you think a miracle is. Has God done miracles in your life? I tend to think the fact that I'm standing here now, after 70 years of my life, the sort of person, the life that I've been through, in a sense, that's a miracle in itself. I'll just tell you one story as I end, and if you come the morning tea, you can talk about, well, what happened there? Because I don't know what happened in this story. I don't have an explanation. So about 5 or 6 years ago, Rob Lamont was preaching through Daniel. And we got to Daniel 6. And Rob said to me, would you preach on Daniel 6? Okay, rightio. So that was the same time as the church assembly. Now the church assembly is over at Croydon. And so all the people go over, we do all the business for the church. So I'm over there sitting in the row, and I've got my computer in front of me and just concentrating on the assembly. And then the principal of the college, Ian Smith, he gets up to speak about some of the things that are happening in the college. And so he starts to talk about things that I wasn't really interested in, lecturers and different things that happen. So I thought, Daniel 6, I wonder what that's about. So I opens up the computer. Oh, okay, that's the lion. That's Daniel in the lion's den. And I'm reading through Daniel 6, and I'm thinking, that's interesting. I wonder where I'm going to get some information to help me to do a message on Daniel 6. And at that exact moment, Ian Smith, the principal of the college, is out the front talking about this and that happening in the college. And he said, look, at the end of the year, we're having a visiting speaker come from America. His name is Brian Chappell, and he's going to bring a lecture on Daniel 6. At the exact moment that I'm looking at this and I'm saying to God, I wonder where I'm getting some information on Daniel 6. At that exact instant, Ian Smith at the front said, he's going to be speaking on Daniel 6. Well, okay, I got on the internet, I looked up Brian Chappell. He had a sermon on Daniel 6 that he'd given me before. I looked through it, and I then used that as for some information that I used on Daniel 6. Now, when I think about that, I think, what happened? I mean, was that a coincidence? Was that a miracle? I mean, it's not a miracle like being saved in the lion's den or fiery furnace, but I sort of think, I don't know what happened there. Maybe we can discuss that at morning tea. Anyway, we're going to do Daniel 7 next. That's, as I said, one of the more difficult chapters in the whole of the Bible. So have a look at that, and we'll be there in about 3 weeks. So I hope you've enjoyed that, and that God maybe will speak to you from what we've done this morning.